Some of my colleagues have made note of the fact that the female humans tended to brew the coffee more than William Walker himself did, and they tended to pour it. This, I assure you, wasn't lost on me. I wouldn't be much of an anthropologist if it was. It made me wonder if there was a division in sex roles over the coffee, and whether this expressed some form of dominance or subservience between the two sexes. As it turns out, William is not particular about it, but his wife is. So she tends to be the one to make it, and because of the way their labor is divided up, she is more likely to provide it. As William said to me, when I was in the military, bad coffee was more or less a tradition, and when you get used to bad coffee, anything will do. My wife is more particular. She likes it a certain way, so I let her make it. As long as I don't touch the pot, her little domain, she's happy to handle the pouring too. He snorted when he said it, a little amused by the anecdote. Rebecca, however, quickly chimed in. I still think you weaponized incompetence because you like to watch me walk. Pervert. I must add, human social interactions vary wildly. He and his wife, for example, engaged in playful, teasing banter. They both had a deep love of language and enjoyed playing with words and taunting each other. You have seen the use of dad jokes and dad puns extensively already. It is telling of the recent stress that those jokes and puns were gone for weeks. But now that it looked as if everything would be fine, what can I say, oh wonderful wife of mine? Watching your winsome, wily walk will keep my eyes from wandering elsewhere. You can't blame me for enjoying it. He winked up at her when she went to put the coffee pot away and answered, I can, and I'm more than happy to. She said it with a wink, which I took to mean they were being playful with one another again. The mood of the Walker household was restored. Most of the time, before things went bad, there was more banter about the house, but today, after everything, their eyes were mostly focused on their respective data devices. To be honest, so was mine. Orderly as they were, each of the trio was on a different streaming media platform, eyeing the news for fresh information. Derek Horn, the amusement park mogul, was arrested today by the EIB on federal corruption charges after multiple witnesses stepped forward claiming payoffs to victims. The alleged victims ranged from 13 to 30. All were allegedly accosted by his son, 26-year-old Derek Horn Jr. Additional charges include obstruction of justice, witness intimidation, destruction of evidence, harassment, assault, attempted kidnapping, and the forcible detention of a minor. That was what the broadcast said on my screen, and no sooner than the words were halfway through than William, Rebecca, and Fove dropped their devices on the table with a loud enough and hard enough clatter that an only lightly touched glass of milk beside Fove's plate toppled over and spilled. Nobody said anything. I doubt they even noticed. They rushed from their positions to stand behind me and look down over my shoulders. That's him! We all said at once, all my hearts pounded with excitement. The male I dubbed Wolfbeard was waddling down the marble steps of a widespread mansion, while drones hovered nearby, catching it all on camera forever. Wolfbeard's hands were cuffed and he was sobbing like a baby. It's not fair! It's not fair! They wanted me to do it. My dad even paid them to make it okay. You can't do this. Shut up, you imbecile. The older man, presumably his father, answered. Derek looked a lot like his son in some ways. He was clean-cut, face-shaved, well-dressed in a business suit and tie, but he had a bit of garishness to him. The buttons of his suit were platinum, and his shoes polished to a mirror shine. His son was just a pathetic reflection of his father, like a young version of the old man if he let himself go in his youth. The old man's hair was fading into obscurity, and a steely-eyed look in his eyes promising retribution was marred by one thing. Those steely eyes kept darting around him. It reminded me of the way Fove looked when she had to leave the house, afraid she was surrounded by threats. The officers of the EIB were not dressed in anything resembling tactical gear, except for thin bulletproof vests. Other than that, their navy blue suits would have passed for any ordinary clothing from any ordinary person. The EIB, wow, this escalated quickly. William whistled and, unfortunately, I had to ask. What's that? The Earth Investigation Bureau, they handle crimes that span the globe. If a conspiracy spreads out over more than one continent, they get involved. I'm surprised they'd get involved in something like this unless... Rebecca trailed off and turned her eyes toward William. That's bad. That's very, very bad. William went a little green in the face, but I was at a loss to explain why. I hate to ask more questions, but what? I asked, keeping an eye on the screen as the pair was walked out of their property toward a waiting squad car. Rebecca put her hand on my head and began to idly scratch. I leaned into it while she talked. Touching my fur seemed to relax her some while she explained. Bailey, Derek's son could have just meant people here, patrons to the park that he'd make uncomfortable, or worse. But rich people travel, and some people travel to places where they can get away with a lot more, where people still don't have all the options they should. It's a horrific kind of tourism. Things are better than they used to be, but the planet only unified about 200 years ago. Our little blue dot is a very big place to those of us who live here, and it takes a long time to fix everything. In another 100 years, all that will be resolved. It just won't be possible anymore. But until then, William shook his head sadly. Catching these kinds of people can be hard. But wasn't the point of all your wealth restrictions and systems to keep people accountable and make sure they couldn't just buy their way above the law? I asked, and William nodded back to me. People cheat, and sometimes the cheaters prosper. We learn from them, refine our laws, methods of investigation, but making this world a better place is a constant struggle. Till we make a better human, we just have to make do with the good ones we've got and look after our own family as best as we can. When he said that, he put a hand on my shoulder and gave it a firm squeeze. My tail immediately began to wag back and forth just as the pair reached the squad cars. "You can't! I'm a werewolf! I won't survive in a cage!" Wolfbeard shouted as they pushed his waddling form down and made him get into the car. "Idiot!" was the last thing I heard his aged father say as the door slammed on them both. Fauve raised her head to her parents. "Mom, Dad, can I eat dinner later? I'd like to go play with Bailey." "Tennis ball?" I asked. My tail went into overdrive with its wagging. "Tennis ball." She answered in the affirmative, then saw the milk she'd spilled that was now dripping off the table after spreading over a fair amount of the wood surface. "I'll clean that up first." "Nah, don't worry about it. I'll take care of it," her father said, and reached for a napkin from the center of the table. "Go ahead. Go play with him. The food will be in the fridge when you get back. Just use the well-lit areas," Rebecca said with a cheery smile, and went to the other side of the table, picked up the plate, and brought it to the counter where she wrapped it up for storage while her father mopped up the mess of spilled milk. "Thanks, Mom. Thanks, Dad," she said, paused, and while her smile never wavered, she added in a far more serious voice, "I mean it. I know," William said. "Go, play, have fun. We'll be here when you get back. Everything is fine." He tossed the wet handful of napkins into the waste bin, and Fauve and I headed for the door. I didn't yet know all that the future held for us, but I was sure of one thing in that moment. William was right. But there was something else. We still had 2 guards at the door, a human and a Delamisa, who chatted amicably while scanning their respective areas. We wondered just what happened to the other 2, only to find that they were already at the park, and the big Delamisa was rushing back to the human with a ball in his mouth that with every closing of his jaws squealed like a captured beast. Now we come to the end of the first volume of my time with the Walker family. My introduction to them was swift, my acceptance faster than I had any right to expect, and the trial we endured was quite literally otherworldly, at least to me. I conclude this volume, and the first day of my recitation for my doctorate, with the aftermath. I'll never know just what my government said to the Earth government. That kind of thing is GC classified, which is to say, generationally classified. It won't be put out into the public sphere until after everyone involved has died. But whatever it was had far-reaching consequences. The legal teams responsible for harassing the Walker family underwent some fairly stringent reviews by the Humans Board of Ethics. Those who had strongly implied various kinds of threats that did not directly involve the courts faced serious censure. 2 lost their licenses to practice law. Most, however, walked away after being able to show that they were acting in the interests of their clients. Perhaps that was true, but I had come to like the human conscience when it worked, and was somewhat disappointed that not all of them paid a price for their actions. Though it is somewhat of a consolation that they were at least unable to work for any government or government-connected employee. My homeworld refused to do business with anyone who hired them. Was it petty? Yes. Satisfying? Also yes. The ones Fauve termed flying monkeys who on their own, without any payment that was ever found, engaged in all that horrific behavior toward a minor? They had various outcomes depending on just what they said. Some took confinement, some took prison, based on their threats of violence and the likelihood of carrying it out. A few ended up in mental institutions, and a handful were fined significantly. She never bothered to look them up. Their relevance to her life was gone. Oddly enough, a few of those responsible actually reformed on their own. They reached out over the years, offering sincere apologies for their behavior and expressing regret for who they were. Fauve rejected their apologies, and I suppose it was proof of their reform that those whose apologetic hands were slapped away accepted her refusal and left her in peace. I would be remiss if I neglected to point out that after she wrote about the experience years later, some humans criticized her unwillingness to forgive them, calling on her to be the bigger person, and Fauve's response to that was, classic Fauve. No, it doesn't make what they did any better. It doesn't erase it from history, and it wouldn't change how they made me feel when I was just a kid. All accepting their apology would do is make them feel better about themselves and what they did. You don't get to do that and then ever be okay with it. You don't get a pardon just because you feel bad. They did what they did, and now they have to live with it for the rest of their lives. Whoever said you should always forgive anyone who feels bad was an idiot. Like I said, Fauve would have made a fine Lamisa. The one I called Wolfbeard folded faster than a wet napkin when the pressure was really applied, and gave a full confession on the condition that he avoid confinement. Given the mounting evidence and number of victims, I can only imagine what kind of mental sentence he would have had to live through. He was sentenced to 3 20-year terms and was still imprisoned as of this writing. I can't help but think he probably believed his father's money would end up getting him out of it. Whether he still plays his game of being a werewolf or not, I have no idea. But there was no more of that. Derek Horn Sr. had the entirety of his fortune confiscated, his corporation was liquidated, sold, and the victims paid off from the proceeds. The water park was bought by a cooperation entity named Twain Travels, so in the end, that park wasn't even lost. It was still around when I eventually left Earth. As to the old man himself, he was sentenced to confinement, and walked out of the unpleasant room several hours later. He was witnessed by drones, and when I saw the clip of his departure, he was a shell of himself. His confidence and arrogance were wiped cleaner than his estate. His eyes were more barren than his reputation and legacy. What he lived through I don't know, but he would not be causing anyone any more trouble after that. He didn't even have the will left to fight the sale of his property. Thanks to the verdict and the nature of his crimes, he was forbidden from ever owning or operating any for-profit or non-profit entity for the rest of his life. Nor was he permitted to work in any position of authority over another human being again. I stopped checking up on him after a few years, once Fauve became an adult, but the last I learned of him until I read his obituary was that he was working in a hotel as a concierge. I don't know if he ever bothered to visit his son or not, but maybe? I never met him, but as we would learn, he bailed his son out of trouble time and time again. Wolfbeard was sent to a multitude of therapists over the years, some of whom would testify to the sentencing committee, and he got all the best schools, which he was either kicked out of, dropped out of, or failed out of. His father even gave him the job at the park that let him encounter Fauve, and brushed aside all the complaints, paid off families and victims, all over the place. Some of my colleagues from my class have said that it was to protect himself and his good name, not his son. But it so closely mirrors the Walkers, like some shadow on the ground that is the outline of a good family, that I just don't think it is that simple. Perhaps he loved his son, and raged against misfortune every night that Wolfbeard became the man he did. Perhaps he was a neglectful father, or a good one, or perhaps he spoiled the boy and turned him into a spoiled man. I never learned what happened to his mother. I never saw her on a video. Perhaps she was gone long ago, died or left or driven off. I was asked not to look into it by the people who gave justice to Fauve, so I honored their request, albeit with some regrets. I do sometimes think that trying to protect Wolfbeard from the consequences of his actions is what destroyed his son in the end. I can't say with certainty what the truth is about them, but they were a dark mirror reflection of the family I found myself becoming a part of. William, Rebecca, and Fauve came together to look after one another and brought me into their fold with open arms. Through this experience, I got to see parts of myself I didn't even know existed. From trivial things like having my head out a car window going at high speeds, to comforting things like head scratches and pats, to bizarre things like chasing that blasted tennis ball, to the biggest things of all, the power of a bonded human unit. In the back of my mind, I still had the worry of being thrown off-world, but for the moment at least I didn't have to worry about deportation. There was simply too much to do, and the man I call Wolfbeard was still filing motions of appeal that would require me to testify. I don't think he realized that he was doing me a favor and keeping me here and delaying that question just a little longer. I sure wasn't going to tell him, that much was for sure. As I wrote these final words to this first volume, I went back and began to read through my work, editing it as any author, both academic or fanciful, would. And it was only then that I realized something. Long before this final word, without even noticing I'd done it, I started referring to the walkers, Fauve in particular, as mine. And they were. Somehow, without my own awareness, despite all my note-taking and observations at every step, my human hosts became my human family. I'd come to love them, and I couldn't have been happier about it.
Thank you to everybody who stayed with this story to the end of the first volume. It was a real joy to write, and I'm grateful to know it brought some joy into your lives. Along with a series of short stories, I've also authorized the channel owner here to narrate, and I hope you take just as much pleasure in all of those. There's a long road ahead for Bailey and his humans. Some of it will be uncomfortable, some of it will be challenging, some of it will be wholesome, and some of it will be heartache. But writing even the hardest word was a pleasure. Most of my work is in the fantasy/dark fantasy genre, so this one was a big departure for me. Hard to believe it all began from an r/humans or space orcs prompt. If you enjoyed my work and want to find more of it, well, this series sells well on Amazon. Just pull it up, and by all means, if you pick it up, leave a review as a sacrifice to the gods of the algorithm. Or, of course, support me on Patreon, where I'll be posting new stories and chapters on a regular basis. My Patreon site can be found here at patreon.com/telling stories. I think you'll enjoy my next fantasy story, Lich Interrupted, about an elder lich who just wants to write novels, but is constantly interrupted by the stray children he has unwittingly adopted. I have millions of words ahead for you, and I hope you enjoy most of them, if not all. Till the next book, this is Robert signing off.